Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I know these are obviously incredibly challenging times, and we appreciate you making the time to be with us today for a conversation about micromobility and what it means for our cities. And I think it's incredibly important. And I know we have some of the panelists who can talk about kind of what it means when not just you have micromobility, but when the city's able to shut it off, even for a short amount of times, as we've seen play out, for example, last night with the curfew in New York. So without further ado, let me share with you our panelists and welcome the chance for them to introduce themselves, and maybe they can also just sort of couch their introduction with kind of where they're at with their work and how it's playing out, especially with these days. So we're incredibly fortunate to have Frank Reg, who's the CEO of Revel, an electronic moped sharing company with service in New York City, Miami, Oakland, and DC. And I think, Frank, you also just recently expanded into Manhattan, right? So I'm sure you'll talk a bit more about that and where you're operating. We have Nora Kern, who's the ED at Walk Bike Nashville. She's been there for 5 years and has spearheaded a number of really ambitious advocacy programs, also including looking at opportunities to expand micromobility in Nashville. And we have Georgia Yexley, who's the head of growth for the London-based bike share Barrel. Barrel will be launching bike share in Staten Island this year, and we're incredibly fortunate that we work with both Revel and Barrel, and excited to have them in the conversation and also to learn from our counterparts in Nashville. So maybe with this, why don't we just get started? And I'd welcome Frank. Do you want to introduce yourself first, and then we can do Nora and Georgia?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Danny. Appreciate it. So as Danny mentioned, CEO and co-founder of Revel. For those that don't know us specifically, we're a shared electric moped operator. We run a fleet of about 5,000 mopeds across 5 markets. So the ones Danny mentioned: Oakland, Miami, DC, New York, and also Austin. I think when we were originally setting up this webinar, we were living in a very much coronavirus front and center world. Clearly things have changed over the last week. But I think when it comes to COVID-19, something that Revel did immediately was expand our existing systems. So in New York, for instance, we worked with regulators and electeds to expand into Manhattan and also the South Bronx with a fleet of mopeds to provide service to residents and users. We also did that while providing, since mid-March, free rides for all healthcare workers. So since we've had that program, we've given just shy of 40,000 rides with an average trip length of over 4 miles, just to give you an idea of just that impact for healthcare workers. We've also had a restaurant partnerships program that we have about 40 restaurants signed up just in New York. I actually come from the restaurant world in my prior background, so I have a soft spot for independent restaurants. So 40 restaurant partners, 30 days of free use of Revel to do deliveries with, just because we were hearing so much about sort of delivery fees and just some awful stuff happening out there from third parties. And then when the subway decided, for public safety reasons to do cleaning, to shut down from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., we then decided, okay, I think this is a good time to go 24/7 because people need a way to get around at 2, 3 a.m. So I'll just pause there, but looking forward to this.
Yeah, well, hey everybody, my name is Nora Kern. I'm the executive director of Walk Bike Nashville, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. And we're a small group that's dedicated to making Nashville more walkable, bikeable, and livable. And we've been involved in the discussion around micromobility here in Nashville for over a year and a half. We've had scooters on the ground for quite a while, over a year. And before that, we had a docked bike share system, but we've yet to have a dockless bike share system. And there's over that time, there had been a lot of tension around regulations, around where they should go, around infrastructure, around who micromobility was for. And I think that conversation has really evolved over the time that vehicles have been on the ground here in Nashville. But interestingly, kind of the opposite thing has happened compared to other cities here in Nashville. All micromobility was closed for the first at least 6 weeks of the pandemic. So we've been in a mostly micromobility free space for the last several months, and it's just starting to reopen here in the last couple of weeks. But happy to be here and part of the conversation.
Thanks. Nora, before we move on, can you just share, is there a curfew going on, or is there any impact of mobility these days in Nashville?
We've had a couple nights of curfew. Saturday and Sunday both had curfews, but those curfews have been lifted, at least at the moment. But Micromobility actually has its own curfew, so all scooters have a cap at 11 o'clock at night. So there's different curfews for there.
Thanks. Georgia.
Hi, so thanks for having me. I think just before I introduce myself and Beryl properly, I would just want to say thanks to everybody for showing up today, but especially, you know, people of ethnic minorities and people of color and Black people that are joining this call today in a time where it's really difficult and can be really difficult to show up. It was difficult for me today. So yeah, just to thank you, and I'm looking forward to learning more about, you know, the role that micromobility has to play in the US currently. I think when we did set up this conversation, even with the focus on COVID-19 and how that's impacted our communities, at least here in the UK, we definitely have to recognize that it disproportionately affects communities of Black and ethnic minorities. So it's definitely something in our thinking about how we've approached this and how we will continue to approach it as a business, but also as individuals. So thank you. Beryl are a micromobility operator based out of the UK. Our heritage is actually in cycle safety accessories. So we started with the laser light, which you may have seen on New York City bikes previously. They're also on the Boris bikes or Santander cycles here in London. With that experience over a number of years and working with other operators and working with cities more closely, we were actually able to gain a lot of experience in how bike share systems should operate for the community. We actually developed a hybrid bike share system, so not quite the free floating systems that we've seen around the world, with a little bit more control and a little bit more partnership with the local authorities that we work with. So we had been hoping to launch our service on Staten Island this year in April. Because of COVID-19, that has pushed back our launch date. We're still planning to launch on Staten Island. So I'm looking forward to, you know, sharing a little bit more about what that journey's been like for us. I'm very pleased to be able to, you know, join conversations like this and continue our learning before we have that launch.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and thank you all for being with us. And you know, Georgia, maybe I'll start with you. Is you know, one of the things that we're seeing here, and I know Frank, this touches your work as well, is kind of the way that transportation is being used now, especially in New York, where we're cutting service in the evening. Now we have curfews in terms of where you can and cannot go. So I guess, can you give us a window into if there's been any impact on the service that you're able to provide because of the events, at least in the last few days here, and kind of how you're thinking about providing services to people who need them the most?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we go back to when the pandemic was starting to unfold, even being an operator in London and having our bikes, a lot of our design work, a lot of our assembly of the bikes and everything is done here in the UK, but we do have manufacturers and suppliers overseas, in China, in Taiwan, all over. So the effects of COVID-19 did start to kind of trickle into our supply chain really early on, especially in how we were approaching the launch on Staten Island. So we had to take that into account from quite an early stage. I think, you know, we even had launch happen. So we launched a new city scheme in Norwich here in the UK, right on the day when our Prime Minister gave an address saying no non-essential travel. That was the day that we launched our scheme in partnership with the city there, which obviously has had massive effects on the way that we were able to promote that scheme, get people aware of it, get people riding. So we've certainly seen a really different effects in different cities. If we look at London, we were able to operate for a short period of time, but it's very different in London to how it is in the rest of our cities, where we're working with one city partner for the entire location. In London, we're looking at loads of different boroughs. So each of the boroughs that we're operating in has a different process. It makes it really difficult for us to have our operations teams manage it safely. So London, we're actually really proud of this. London is the only scheme that we had to pause, but with doing that, we were thinking about, well, how do we continue to offer the same options that we're providing to key workers in the rest of our cities to also our community in London? So what we chose to do was actually keep some of the bikes on street and loan them directly to key workers who reached out to us and let us know that they wanted to go buy a bike. I spoke with one of them the other day, this amazing nurse who's been working in the ICUs here. She's been riding Barrel bikes every day. She's ridden over 100 times. It was a very humbling conversation to understand what it meant for her to have this option. So it's definitely ingrained in our thinking. Similar to what Frank mentioned, our first thought during the pandemic was, how do we support the key workers? How do we keep them moving? They have to continue to keep moving through this. They need ways that are socially distant. They need ways that are accessible and affordable and safe. So again, there we partnered with our local authority partners, the city, and we were able to offer free access to NHS, so the National Health Service, as well as more widely, we were offering voucher codes to key workers that got in touch. So I think we have currently given about 400,000 minutes to key workers, and then there's been a little under 7,000 trips taken by NHS staff across the UK. So that was our first thought, and we did that pretty much instantly. On the same day that the address was given, no non-essential travel, only key workers to move around the city. It was, because we're such a small team, because we're very lean, we're not, a huge VC funded, we're B Corp. So that guides a lot of, the decision making in our business. It was same day to the CEO, how do we do something? Can we offer something free to key workers? Yes, we can. Let's talk to our partners and make it happen. So we're able to react quite quickly there.
Thanks. Frank, I'd be curious on your thoughts, and then Nora.
Yep. Yeah, no problem. I think, there's two things here. There's this amazing movement that has swept not just this country, but internationally over the last 7 to 10 days. And there's COVID-19. So in terms of what we've seen the last few days, nights, in terms of curfews being imposed, not just in New York, but Oakland, DC, Miami, all of these cities have, different times, whether it's 6 p.m., 8 p.m., 7 p.m. I think for me as a founder, it's been really tough. I actually had, trouble sleeping the last 2 nights thinking about, here's, a mayor's office, here is a city hall, and pick any of our markets, calling us and directing us to shut down. That is what they are basically requiring. And as a private company that operates in the public right of way and answers to city officials in every market we're in, part of me wants to say, no, we're going to continue operating. Protesters need a way to get from March to home, or vice versa, or they need a way to get around, especially as the city's locking down. But we also answer to the city, and not just New York, but all these other cities that we're in. So it's still a tough decision, but we have abided by their directive, and we're going to continue to this week. So as they tell us when to shut down, we're shutting down. So that's been, it's tough though. You can imagine there's a lot of different things going on, both on a personal level and also as a company level, how we think about that decision. It's not just us, it's City Bike in New York, it's other bike systems, it's everyone in this industry. But I think at the end of the day, we have to just continue to work with cities and partner, and that's the direction we're going. And then I think the other bucket, which is COVID-19 and coronavirus, what we've seen is, from a purely transportation perspective, almost exactly what maybe everybody in urban planning and transportation circles have been talking about, which is, yes, revenue fell off a cliff, ridership fell off a cliff in mid-March, when cities really went into shelter in place, went into quarantine, New York and every other city that we're in. Over the last 6 weeks, Danny, it has been just up and to the right for ridership. It has been crazy. It's been awesome to see, to the point where, we have more ridership, daily ridership in New York City than the New York City ferry system right now. It's pretty incredible. We're basically tripling the ridership we were doing last summer. So in terms of that thesis of what are people going to use coming out of quarantine, coming out of shelter in place, how are they going to get from A to B in cities? People are going to start to think twice about getting on a subway, a metro, a bus, just because you can't social distance. And it's clear they're using other modes like Revel, and we have the data to back it. It's pretty incredible. And Danny, I know you're in New York City. I'm sure you've seen it just anecdotally in the streets, just revel everywhere. I think also trip distance has gone up to over 4 miles since May 1st. So when you just think of, our average trip distance for the last, call it 1.5 years, 2 years has been around 2.83 miles. It's almost gone up like 40%. So I think that's a function of just people commuting more with Revel, a function of people just needing to get out of the house and get on something and go. So just trip distance has gone up about 40%. Ridership has gone through the roof. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nashville's in a pretty different place in a couple of respects. Certainly in terms of the protests we've had, like most cities had, several days of protests, but we have been fortunate that our city has stayed open, and we haven't had curfews, as I mentioned. And our bus system has continued to run throughout that time, which has been really great to see. But at the same time, both this last week and the pandemic have also highlighted some really long-term, deep-rooted issues we have in our transportation system. Our bus system, for example, already doesn't go all night. It ends at 11 or midnight every night. So people who are essential workers, people who are working in hotels and non-traditional hours already don't have a way to get home. And that's true of the micromobility scooters we have as well. But it's also highlighting the fact that unfortunately in Nashville, like many cities around the country, anything that's not a car is still considered not very mainstream for transportation, particularly for essential transportation, despite the fact that we have a lot of people in our city who don't drive, who don't have access to cars. Scooters in particular were both by, I think, the providers and by the regulators seen as a little bit of a plaything. They were seen as primarily benefiting tourism and college students. And that was definitely how the regulations were designed. So that was definitely on the partly on the city's fault. But I think the operators also have some responsibility. And we see now most scooters continue to be in very high income, fancy urban neighborhoods. And there's almost no scooter deployment in neighborhoods of color around our historically Black universities. And so I think now when we're seeing mostly essential workers moving around, I think the scooters haven't picked up to the same extent because we aren't seeing tourists come back. We aren't seeing college students come back. And scooters were kind of designed to help those people and not others. And I think now we're really seeing the repercussions of those decisions by everyone involved.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm curious, and Nora, I'd welcome your insight too, is I think as those of us who are thinking about and have been thinking for a long time about the intersection of cities and mobility, equity and racial justice, and now many cities that do have the opportunity, especially mid-COVID, are thinking differently about about their streets. And so one of the things that we're really worried about here, and we're starting to see an uptick, is the return of traffic and what it means when people obviously are going to step away from public transit. And so we're looking about how do we hold on to the street space to give it back to people, while at the same time seeing that even yesterday, our police were saying that people on the streets were sort of impeding the right of those who were driving. So we clearly have a lot of work that all of us need to do. But I'm curious, what are you seeing sort of on the front lines in Nashville about kind of where the city may emerge from this as it relates to transportation?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think we're similar to a lot of cities. I know in that we have seen a huge boom of people biking and walking and using the streets as traffic has decreased. But on the flip side, I think two really worrying outcomes that have already started to emerge. First, you're definitely seeing, like most places, a real turn away from mass transit and turn towards private vehicles as the best way of getting people around. And I think that's a big concern for any number of reasons we could go through, from environmental to equity to public health reasons. And so we're really focused on how can we continue to highlight that the options don't have to be totally about single occupancy vehicles, and that we need to have a lot of other options tomorrow, just as we did a month ago, just as we did a year ago. And then the other, I think, really troubling issue that we're seeing that I think definitely relates to micromobility as well is safety. And unfortunately, we've actually seen an increase in pedestrian fatalities here in Nashville during the pandemic. And like much of the United States, we've seen a dramatic increase in crashes per mile traveled. And so, it has been great on the one hand that we've had more space for people to be in the streets, but there are a lot of streets that aren't safe. And so those benefits are really shared inequitably around the city, depending on what neighborhood you live in and depending on how your neighborhood was built, and if it was built for people or if it was built for cars. So that's something we want to make sure, we have been launching a Vision Zero effort here over the last year, and have done years of advocacy around safety for scooters, bike riders, and pedestrians. And it's really troubling to see those numbers not turn around, even when there's so many fewer miles being driven. So 2 issues we're kind of paying attention to.
And Georgia, because obviously so much of your success relies on that safe infrastructure and that ability to connect around. I mean, at least from a distance, it seems pretty amazing what's happening in London across the UK. But can you talk about how you're working to advance the type of infrastructure that's required for people to bike around?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really important thing that Nora's touched on there as well is these questions around safety and accessibility and inclusion. They aren't and they should not be new questions. They need to be built into how we're developing these systems and how we're working with the local authority partners or other partners that it may be, or even the wider transport system, to make sure that we're creating something that is accessible across all communities and is keeping people safe and allowing them to travel in ways that are beneficial to our cities, beneficial to our health. I think to your question around what we're doing in this area of making sure that we have the connectivity with the infrastructure and the safety piece. So in the way that we've designed the system, Barrel is actually a hybrid system. It's not entirely free floating. We operate a bay-based system, so we have Barrel bays. The way that we implement our systems is very much in partnership as a supplier, a partner with the local city, with the local authority. So we'll work with them for quite some time ahead of launch to identify the right bays. Of all the 600 bays that we've implemented in the last 12 months, all of them prior to the COVID pandemic have a minimum space of 2.1 meters on the pavement. So it's also thinking about equity of space. And obviously that works really well in terms of parking and how the system is controlled within social distancing and all of these rules that are starting to come through with the pandemic. So, with that, we really have built it into the system. And recently, the most recent systems that we've implemented in Watford and in Norwich, so 2 other UK cities, we have started to use more parklets, planters, and are developing infrastructure with the city. So instead of just having, painted on the ground, so some of our bays are painted on the ground for ease, but also we're actually starting to develop this infrastructure that's creating more space for the city, public greening, useful space, not just for Barrel bike cyclists, other cyclists, pedestrians, and making sure that we're considering the equity of space there as well. But it's also how we are reacting to the current situation, making sure that we are really transparent about how our operations are working, the personal responsibility that is involved in using the system, in not just in how you park, but making sure you're washing your hands and being safe, not riding in groups and following public health recommendations. So a lot of this is coming from the way that we've developed the system and doing it in such a way that it's really in close partnership with the local authority. So, their involvement in how we've progressed through this period and the steps that we've taken has been really deep. All of our communications, even what we put inside the app to all of our users that might have been using it for essential journeys or daily exercise as the rules have changed, has been reviewed by public health partners. So it's very much a collaborative approach and a much more kind of controlled approach. Safety is in our blood. I mentioned our heritage is in cycle safety accessories with the laser light, which was created for urban cycling, very much in connection with the Vision Zero effort here in the UK as well, for cycle safety in the city. So it's something that's been front of mind for us from the start. They're not new questions. They should continue to be questions way beyond the circumstances that we're facing now.
Frank, can you share with us a little bit your perspective on street design? I know that there's obviously a very limited amount of space and everybody's trying to fight for it. And clearly all of us are losing to cars now, but can you kind of share your perspective? I know Revel obviously sort of lives with it. You operate on the street, correct?
Yep.
So I guess, can you maybe give a perspective too of how you start to see some of these other, Revel and some of these other suite of micromobility tools operating together on our streets?
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the head, Danny, in terms of we operate where cars operate. I think it has been part of why I think we've been so successful in major cities like Miami, DC, New York. Is that 90% of the city is designed for cars. And we have a license plate and we operate where those cars are. We park where they are, we ride where they are. That's 90% of the infrastructure. On a more macro level, Revel, myself, I will support anything that gets rid of private car storage on public streets, that opens up more than 90% of infrastructure for other modes of transit, bikes, scooters, walking, pedestrians. I mean, if you're not promoting that, if you're not for that, you're behind on day one. And that's the city, I think all of us want that. So yeah, that's my perspective. It's sort of like, let's change cities, and I think coronavirus gave the regulators this, don't waste your crisis, which is what, a lot of, sort of that's saying. And don't waste that crisis, start changing city infrastructure. We gotta get away from private cars. Literally outside of my apartment for a AC to see. Why did they not take away a lane of private cars? And a bike lane. Right? Like, there are easy things we could be doing in every city.
Frank, I think we're having a bit of a hard time hearing you, maybe your connection. But why don't I go to Nora? Nora, can you, thanks, Frank, it sounds better. So Nora, we had just advanced legislation in New York just through the budget, the governor's budget message to advance e-bikes and e-scooters. And I know one of the big concerns that a lot of cities have is what will happen when these micromobility tools come, especially those that need to be docked on a sidewalk. So can you share maybe your perspective of how these things landed in Nashville and early issues, and maybe share any best practices for New York or other cities that are considering bringing them on?
Yeah, we've learned a lot, like many cities, over the last year and a half around policy and best practices and challenges. So they first arrived in Nashville. Bird arrived first, and they've arrived before they were legally, or there was a legal definition of scooters, and they ended up getting kicked out. And then there was some emergency legislation passed, and then we ended up having 5 companies come in. And then there have been a couple of revisions to the legislation over the last year and a half, including one, most recently, we're moving to an RFP model where rather than letting everybody in, the city's going to select a few companies to come in and then limit the total number. And so I think initially a couple of the major challenges, definitely first one was sidewalk usage. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't have sufficient bike lanes in the city. So most riders are having to pick between riding on the sidewalk, where they feel safer, and riding the street, which is demonstrably less safe. And so that had predictable outcomes. And that, I think, continues to be one of the major issues. And fortunately, we have had some additional bike lanes come in the downtown most urban core that were really largely thanks to the support of some of the scooter companies. So that's been some improvement, but I think will continue to be a challenge that has to be addressed through infrastructure. And then related to that is parking. So originally scooters were allowed to park wherever in a totally dockless system. And that works in some of our more suburban neighborhoods that have more space. But in our urban downtown core, which I imagine is like most of New York City, that was a really major issue. And so we've shifted to a model where scooters are required to park in corrals, which are painted on the ground. And then there's been a lot of tension around how do we mandate that, or is it optional? Can we encourage it? Can we incentivize people to return the scooter to the proper location? And I think figuring out a mechanism that works both for the companies and for the city is really important there. And the corrals have helped a lot, just having a place for people to put scooters and bikes, but there's still some lessons there to be learned. And then I think another really major issue that I have and is definitely related to policy is figuring out what are the city's goals and how can we reflect policy that supports those goals. And so as I was discussing earlier, one of my Walk Bike Nashville's goals is to ensure we have transit options for everybody, particularly those who need them the most, people who are, don't have a car, people who are dependent on transit. And unfortunately, we mostly have scooters near Vanderbilt University, which is a very private university, as well as in our tourist areas near hotels, and then in some of our wealthier neighborhoods. And they are pretty much absent from neighborhoods of color, absent around our HBCUs. And I think that is something that really requires smart policy. If we want to have a network that works for everybody, it can't entirely be on the scooter companies and the micromobility providers to do that, because obviously they're for-profit businesses, and as much as they might want to have scooters in all parts of the city, that I think that's a challenge. And so how can you create policy that really incentivizes equitable distribution and equitable access? And even if that means potentially going out of our ways to provide scooters to people who have fewer options and less access to transit and to cars, even if that's harder. And I think that often is the case. It takes more work to have scooters in neighborhoods where fewer people have credit cards, where people have fewer smartphones. But I think that's a really important thing for this regulation, as well as the companies, to figure out how to do.
Georgia, can you share a bit, if and how sort of the demographics of who's riding has changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say whether the demographics have changed over time, really. I think generally speaking, what we see for bike share is a really, really broad set of users, people that make use of the bikes over ages, genders, backgrounds. And I think to what Nora was saying around making sure that it's a very collaborative approach and looking at how it fits in with the wider transport availability of the area, and the communities that are going to be served by it is really the way to make that the case. At least over the last few weeks or months even, the demographics of who have been riding our bikes have certainly changed dramatically. Just in the restrictions that were placed and focusing towards key workers. I think we did see a lot of people who may not have first felt that the bikes were for them when they first interacted with them or saw one on the street or learned that they were coming to their city. Actually, this pandemic has probably brought them to the forefront of a lot of people's minds. The perspective on cycling as a transport solution here in the UK, at the very least, has changed dramatically in the way it's represented in the media and the public eye. There's a huge amount of focus from the UK government on the role of active transport. So I think people are starting to feel more broadly that it is for them, and they're seeing themselves represented as well in this space, which is really key in the media and in the way that cycling is represented. It's not just, lycra clad and gadget kind of carbon framed guys. It's actually starting to, you're seeing families cycle, you're seeing nurses cycle, you're seeing people cycle to their role in warehouse packaging. So a lot of the people that we've been reaching out to and speaking to, especially on the key worker side, are a super, super broad group of people. And I think, as you start to build equity within different groups and different socioeconomic groups and genders and ages and all sorts, word travels really fast. A lot of the people that were coming through those initiatives were recommended by friends or colleagues that they were working with during that time. And actually by, doing this key workers first and focusing on that and connecting with what was happening in our cities at that time, is actually, had a trickle down effect of creating equity within groups that are served by those people. So then again, more people, it trickles down, more people are feeling that it's for them. And then, with the focus that's happening at the government level on cycling as a part of the response, or public health response even to the current situation, it's opening a lot of doors to work with council partners or other partners that are now seeing funding in this area and seeing a huge amount of focus in this area, to be able to actually open it up even more so and have the support to do that. And again, I think it really does rely on that collaboration, partnership, and those conversations happening at a really regularly and at a really broad level.
Thanks. So Frank, I have to share, I'm half Italian, and I owned a Vespa for many years, so I just happen to love scooters personally. But one of the things now working for a bike and public transit organization is we hear a lot from people about sort of concerns about getting back on a bicycle, and we can say, well, it's just like riding a bicycle, it's just in a much more chaotic city. But can you also talk about sort of how you're building that bridge to getting people to ride a Revel for the first time, because maybe they've never ridden one before, they're riding with traffic. We all are sort of having to get more people into new types of micromobility or mobility options. I'm curious if you can share a bit of how you're doing that.
Yeah. First off, can you hear me now, Danny?
Yeah, hear you just fine.
Okay.
Thanks.
Perfect. So I think, Revel launched over 2 years ago here in New York. So we've sort of grown from a pilot of 70 mopeds to now, a fleet over 1,000 here in New York and, many other cities. From day one in New York and every other city, we've offered one-on-one lessons 7 days a week for free. So that's been something we've done everywhere, not just New York. Last time I checked, we've had several thousand folks in our different markets take us up on that. Take those lessons one-on-one, get comfortable in a dead-end street before they're off on their ride. In this new world of coronavirus, where I have to always be thinking about my own employee safety and whether one-on-one interaction is the right way to go right now. So what we've done is we filmed a full 15-minute lessons video, which we had never done before. There's always been a shorter 2 to 3 minute video within the app and the website to get you up to speed on the vehicle. But for those that want like a really in-depth tutorial on riding a moped that can go up to 30 miles an hour, we filmed that video about 2 weeks ago. So it should be coming out literally in the next couple of days, both in the app and the website. So just trying to adapt to this world where one-on-one lessons might not be possible this summer. So those are two things that come to mind. I mean, when you think of also just safety of the vehicle itself, one thing a moped has is we give you 2 helmets right there in the vehicle and always have. So I think some other forms of micromobility have always struggled with that shared helmet. Where does it go? How do we get this on the vehicle? So that's just something we've always had. And again, in the new world of coronavirus, now we've put, Revel branded permanent helmet liners for people to use in helmet cases so they feel comfortable sharing helmets in this world. And also the option to buy helmets through the website. So I think for us, it's just user education as much as possible. And also just practical things like making sure the vehicle always has 2 helmets for people to use.
So maybe I'll just ask all of you one question and then we'll open it up. But one of the things I came across, and actually a lot of the questions that we received, is whether our cities are going to need multiple protected lanes. So for bikes and let's say for every other type of micromobility. I'm curious if you have perspectives of, whether we can all sort of live and share a bike lane or if we're going to need something else. So Georgia, can I start with you?
Yeah, certainly. So with the focus that's happening on active travel and cycling in particular, as a response to current events, there has been a lot more funding open up for infrastructure developments that are much needed in many of our cities here. There's a lot of different arguments about what the right way is on particular roads that, urban planners, street designers need to get involved in that conversation, are involved in that conversation and lead that. But everybody has a role to play in that. So for us, a lot of it is about sharing data, not personal data, but data about how the bikes are moving, where people need to go, and making sure that that's also feeding back into transport planning and city planning for our local authority partners as well. We definitely think infrastructure is a really important and key piece. We do know that the more that people get cycling, the more that it pushes those things as well. It's a kind of chicken or the egg situation, you know, which should come first, people cycling or the infrastructure. We absolutely need better infrastructure here in the UK. I can say that just from my personal experience cycling in London, there's a lot to be done. I know that there's huge campaigns happening in the US, like the Open Streets campaign. We have similar things happening here with Street Space campaign in London. So a lot of infrastructure is going in because of this, but there's also, you know, community groups taking efforts for themselves. There's a really interesting group, I encourage you to check them out, called Tactical Urbanistas, who are, you know, creating drawings on the street and creating more space that way. As a business, what we've done is go down the route of the parklets and planters. A lot of times what we're actually doing is taking the space of a car parking space for the parklet space, and again, trying to make sure that that is creating space that's not just for our users, but for the community more widely, and creating more space for social distancing on our streets. So, you know, it's a collaborative approach. Everybody has a role to play in it. Infrastructure is key, but getting on a bike is key. Looking at alternative options is key, and just starting to get moving on in this way.
So just before we go to you, Nora, one of the things that I love about talking to other transportation and advocacy folks is that nobody is satisfied with how much their city is doing. So in New York, every day we look and we sort of pray in the direction of London, given everything your mayor is doing. And it seems like, you know, he's clearly not doing enough. So
there can always be more, but you know, I love City keep doing a good job. He is facing you know, a lot of pressures as well from other businesses and organizations. So I think he's doing a great job with street space. We want to see more of it. There's a lot of cycling advocates that are, you know, advisories and interesting groups that I could go on for days about.
Right.
Definitely love what we're trying to do, but there's room for improvement, that's for sure.
That's great. Well, it's good to hear. Nora, let me turn to you.
Yeah, so I could definitely echo that every bike advocate doesn't think they have enough bike lanes in their city. And, that's true in Nashville, and I think there has been some tension around where scooters should go. I do think the first answer is we need to at least have sufficient bike lanes for scooters to use and bike riders to use. And then whether or not we need additional moped lanes or scooter lanes, or hopefully we can have that conversation at some point, but we still are struggling with sidewalks and bike lanes. So I think that's a first place to start. There definitely has been some tension between bike riders and scooters in Nashville, but I can understand it in some ways. It's always hard to see someone who's doing something very different than you in the same space. But at the end of the day, I really think those sorts of decisions should be driven by safety, first and foremost. And what we know is unsafe is mixing slow-moving people that are exposed, not in metal boxes, with cars. And, you know, unfortunately, we had a young man riding a scooter killed by a car here in Nashville. And so I think the first priority is how do we protect the vulnerable users, which are now people on bike, people on foot, and people on scooters, from the most dangerous vehicles on the road. And as far as I know, there have been few, or definitely in Nashville, no serious injuries between scooters and bicyclists or scooters and pedestrians. We might be really annoyed with each other on many bases, but let's first start with making everyone safe, and then we can figure out how do we make sure everyone feels comfortable and is not pestered by you know, the wrong vehicle. But overall, I think it's great. There's more traffic in my bike lanes now, so I think that is a positive, even if they're on a scooter instead of on a bicycle.
That's great. One less car.
Exactly.
Frank?
You know, from my perspective, you know, your original question was, do we need multiple lanes and differentiating each lane for different modes of transit? You know, I immediately think of, you know, you have kick scooters, you have bicycles, you have e-bikes, you have e-mopeds, you have cars, you have commercial traffic. I tend to think, no, you need two lanes. One that's, I'll just call a slower lane, and one that's a faster lane. I'm more interested in making sure that the faster lane isn't 3 lanes. because then you're not going 25 or 28 miles an hour, you're going 38, 45 miles an hour. And then something like an e-moped that goes, up to 29, 30 miles an hour can't safely be there. So I think it's kind of making sure the fastest lanes of traffic are slowed down and slimmed. And then that slower lane of traffic, whether you want to call it a bike lane or whatever sort of language you want to use, I think that kind of makes sense instead of trying to differentiate things into 0 to 15 and 15 to 25 and something else. So I think that's just kind of how I holistically think about infrastructure. It's like exactly what Transportation Alternatives is trying to do, right? Slow cars down and get them off the road and reduce the amount of lanes they have. That is all wins for everybody.
Good, thanks. So Georgia and Frank, we had a question that came in that was asking about how you approach data, and it's specifically asking if whether you use sort of knowledge of how people use your products to share with them that they may be doing something wrong.
I can definitely
I can hop in. Oh, go for
it. Okay, so we do use data. We use a lot of data, but I think I mentioned earlier in the call that we are a B Corp. So I don't know, lots of people aren't familiar with that term. It's definitely across the UK and the US, but it means essentially that we're a business that puts profit and sustainability and community impact on the same level. So it governs a lot of how we operate our business. It means we don't collect personal data, we don't share personal data. So things about demographics or personal information is not a part of what we do. But where we do use data a lot is in the bikes themselves. So the bikes are all IoT connected, so we understand how they're moving around the city. We also use geofencing technology. So I mentioned we're bay-based, a hybrid scheme. So we use the geofencing technology to look at where the bays are and make sure that people are parking within the bay or parking correctly. So certainly in terms of user behaviors and how we use data there, we would be looking at, if you've parked outside of a bay, we'll be making sure to let you know, hey, you're outside of a bay. And what we do is financially incentivize people to park inside the bay. So we find 98% of trips do end in bays. If you park outside of a bay, we'll let you know. You're parked outside of a bay, you may incur a fee. Please park responsibly and ensure that we're providing that information of what responsible parking looks like. So again, it's building that level of control. And that's on how we kind of apply it with the user. But then we're also collecting lots of really valuable data about how people cycle in the city, where they want to go, where they might be finding difficulty in reasonable routes. So we absolutely then feed that back to our city partners for transport planning, for city planning, to make sure that they're considering cyclists within how they're adapting streets. So we recently had a really interesting initiative that happened during the pandemic, where one of our local authority partners was resurfacing a huge road, and we were able to, one of the main roads in the city that connects a lot of the other routes, and we were able to encourage them to actually allow people to go through that road while the roadworks were happening by bike, which was possible, and not by car. So we found that actually a lot of people, we normally see about 20% of our respondents at the end of trip survey saying that they would have gone by car. We think, we haven't checked it yet, but we think that's going to change in that city during that time. We saw a huge influx of people actually sign up and use a promo code with them to take that route, because they were finding an alternative and a better route to go. So now that we've got that information, we're talking a lot with that council partner, the local authority partner, around all the other infrastructural projects that they have on road resurfacing and road works that are happening, on how we can enable people to go by bike instead of by car because of those things that are happening. So all of those pieces are completely data led. There's a huge amount of data learning that happens there, and we have to be really communicating a lot of that with our local authority partners, so we make sure that that data is actually being used for something that has a real big value for our cities and the people in them.
I mean, when it comes to data for Revel, in certain permits that we have, like Austin or DC, we absolutely do share data with the Department of Transportation of those cities. Granted, it's aggregated, it's not specific, but it's a way for them to do their own planning as a city and understand where the priority should be, where people are taking trips.
you know, they love to see that sort of data, just understanding their own city better as a transportation official. I think from just a company privacy perspective, I'm the CEO of Rebel, I don't have access to user profiles, right? Because there's no reason for me to. And that's just an example of just how we make sure we're protecting our users in terms of just their data that we have about themselves. And then maybe like a very specific tangible thing that we do, especially when it comes to safety, which I think you mentioned, Danny, is that, you know, our data science team has set up an alert on every park in every city that we operate in. So if for some reason there's somebody going into a park where clearly more vehicles not allowed, our team gets an alert, and we call that user. Depending on the severity of it, they either get a warning or they're suspended. So that's just a more specific example of how we're using data to, I think, just help the safety of the system and make sure that we're operating successfully in any market we're in. So hopefully that gives you some color on how we think about data.
So one question that came through was about what things that either your city or cities should be doing more broadly to be incentivizing micromobility, or I guess in this case, even bicycles too. So are there sort of mandates or specific things, Nora, that we'll start with you, that you might suggest or your city's doing to try to get people out of cars?
Incentivizing to the rider, not to the company?
To an individual to make the decision to use one of these tools.
I think that's a great question. We haven't seen a lot of that from any official capacity, but definitely all the companies have incentives for new riders, and discounts and first free rides and all of those sorts of things. One area I'm really interested in is connecting our micromobility platforms to our transit system. So we're going to be moving to a digital and card-based payment system, so that you could load money on your card to ride the bus, get off the bus and tap it and ride a scooter, and potentially either get a discounted ride on that scooter or a free ride to finish your last mile. And I think that would be a really great way to integrate it into the transportation system. So that's one aspect. And then another aspect I'm really interested in is during our major special events or any large gathering of people, obviously that creates huge traffic and congestion and all sorts of issues for the city. And I think there's a real incentive to figure out, can we get people to use micromobility to get to that event? Can we open up, pop up micromobility lanes to a protest or to a football game or whatever it is, if and when we ever have major events again? And then maybe a third way would be really working with employers. So we are developing kind of travel demand management programs in Nashville, and part of that is going to be requiring employers to look at offering a multitude of benefits besides just free parking. So could they offer a transit pass? Could they offer micromobility? Could they offer helmets? Those sorts of things to integrate it into people who are incentivizing transportation.
Right. Frank, maybe I'll turn to you. You mentioned ferries, and obviously they're one of the most subsidized things in New York, but how would you think about that question of getting more people onto these modes?
Well, it's interesting, sort of this coming out of coronavirus now, coming out of quarantine, the amount of, I guess I'll call it, real estate organizations, developments, reaching out to Rebel right now, asking about partnerships, and they want to move fast because they're thinking about how are they going to get their employees to this place, whether it's the Rockefeller Centers of the world or the Brooklyn Navy Yards of the world, or condo developments in Austin, because clearly everyone getting into their own car is not going to be the way. So it's just interesting, sort of some of these initiatives are already happening, partnerships with specific organizations, developments, buildings, companies in all of our markets. All of that is just accelerated, which is really cool to see. I think something Rebel's done since we launched our pilot in 2018 is we've always had an access program. So 40% off for members that are any form of local, state, federal public assistance. So that's just something we've always done. I know we have over 1,000 signed up for that program. And that's something we need to be doing more. Like I want 10,000 signed up to make sure that people that, they do need, I'll just call it subsidized forms of transit, Rebel is there for them. you know, in terms of just something like our healthcare initiative that we started mid-March that we ran for 10 weeks, you know, after you get 40,000 rides and they're all completely for free, you know, I don't use the gig economy, right? So every person at Revel that you see in the street swapping batteries, fixing mopeds, answering the phones, they have health insurance that they don't pay an extra $1 for from their salary, and they have a living wage, right? So there is a certain point where if I'm going to continue offering massive amounts of free rides, I will need some sort of subsidy. So we're phasing out that program right now as we speak. So just to give you some insight into like how we think about, you know, how do we get more people onto transit, but then there's also the realities of operating a business. I need to provide for my employees and it's a business, but also always keeping the community in the city front and center. And if you're not doing everything you can, you're behind. So it's sort of, you know, that's the world I operate in of trying to connect all these dots.
Georgia.
I'm so glad I get to speak on this because we have just launched our Better by Bike campaign for this very reason. It's really about incentivizing people to try it. And I know, Nora, you talked about a lot of these schemes focusing on new users. In most of the incentives and the initiatives that we have in each of our cities, it's actually really broad. We don't only want to capture new users, we also want to provide access and not alienate the people that have tried the bikes for essential travel or daily exercise. We also want them to start to build habits and form it into their more regular routines when they're starting to return back to work. So more directly to the individual, we also want them to make that choice. So a lot of the initiatives that we're doing, and to the point of being financially sustainable, they are in partnership with our local authority partner. They're funded by Department for Transport here funding. So there's a 250 billion pot that the government has set aside specifically for active travel that we're working very closely with our city partners to allocate in ways that we feel are actually going to really get people to form those habits and create that behavior change. That's based on the learning that we have in what we've done in cities previously. So we had done an initiative in one of our smaller cities months and months and months ago, where we just made it free for everybody to access for a week. So it was funded by our local authority partner through grant funding that they had for the city for active travel. And we saw the the behavior change was huge. The mode share for cycling went from 4% to 7% just during that week. And so we have the evidence there to say, if we can make it free or make it low cost, if we can do that at an extended period of time, that we would still continue to see a really positive growth continue from that point onwards, and it's worth investing for that period of time. So some of the schemes that or the initiatives that we're doing are around offering our 200-minute bundles. So we work on minute bundles. Actually, that's quite important. Our pricing model is set up in such a way that it's by the minute. You never there's no expiry on your minutes, so whatever you buy is yours. There's lots of promotions that we do to bring that down, but we've priced it at 5p per minute here in the UK, which is extremely affordable in comparison to other transport forms. There's a lot of research around the by minute pricing model being more accessible for people in low socioeconomic groups. So that's been done very specifically as well. But a lot of the initiatives that we're doing are around developing those behaviors long term. So if it's offering a bundle for free to the city widely, we're saying, okay, make it the 200-minute bundle, make sure it's enough for somebody to form a habit to cycle to and from work every day and actually develop that behavior. So that's one of the ones we're doing. In another scheme, actually the city partner that we're working with is using their funding to potentially fund the scheme entirely free for 2 months to everybody. It's a smaller city, it's a lot more manageable operationally there. Similarly to Revel, everybody that works at Beryl is Beryl. We partner with local businesses as well. So in this smaller city, we partner with a cargo bike operator to do all of our logistics. So, these initiatives, we do need that partnership. We need the support from a government level. There needs to be funding made available to encourage people to move in this direction. We need to set up wider campaigns that are using positive words even around cycling as a transport option. So this Better by Bike campaign is also about making it visible, making all types of cyclists visible, that this is a positive way to travel, it's a safe way to travel socially, all of the good things and all of the positive impacts that this has in the city, making that visible to change the conversation about where cycling sits in the city. So yeah, we're super excited to have launched this campaign. It's not a one and done type thing. There's a number of initiatives that are happening within that, and will continue to happen throughout the months ahead as we start to return to normal routines. A lot of that as well, I can echo the amount of emails and inquiries we're getting from private businesses and various organizations that now want to find ways to get people back to work safely. So certainly that kind of collaboration is also really key for us, being able to work with the city itself, but also with large organizations, employers that have a responsibility to their employees to travel safely and to put their health first.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I know we're just a little bit over time, and I just want to acknowledge everybody for being here on this day, which is obviously a difficult day, and we'll hopefully continue to have these types of conversations, and also as they relate to how we make safer and more just streets and cities together. So I want to thank you, Georgia and Nora and Frank, for being with us today. I want to thank everybody who joined us. Frank, there are actually a few questions that came through for you that we didn't get a chance to answer, but maybe what we'll do is we'll send them to you, and if you wouldn't mind, you can maybe write up a sentence or two and we can share them back with those who are interested. But again, thank you all for joining us. We'll have our next conversation around e-bikes, which will be next week, and then open streets the week after. And then we'll have a conversation around open streets and hospitality as well. So thank you again for joining us. Please be well, stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.